Great. So this is a horribly intimidating subject. I feel like it's probably, it's like up there with disinformation. It's sort of the topic. The role of experts in rebuilding trust in journalism. I think that the journalism community, we're really among friends at this festival, has been so worried for so long about the idea that trust is declining in the media. And it's really sort of frustrating looking at this subject. Some of you have heard, I've just finished this 10,000 word literature review on media trust. I went back to the 1930s and read all the academic work I could find since then. And it's incredibly frustrating how little we actually know about trust, what makes people trust things, what makes them lose trust, how to rebuild trust. Do people trust experts because they have expertise? Are they more credible because they have expertise? Is trust actually something that's completely innate and has nothing to do with journalism practice? These are all questions that academics are actually still researching and are really pretty uncertain about. So it's a very sort of thorny subject, and I think we're very, very brave to try to tackle it in just 1 hour, and you're very brave to come and listen to us. I'm going to introduce the panelists, even though you all have the program. Mary Fitzgerald, who's editor-in-chief of openDemocracy, and we'll actually be on another panel together about media capture. Anya Kerr, who's the co-founder of Kinzen. So you're a new thing, and I've subscribed to you, but I'm hoping you'll tell us all a little bit more about what you do. Misha Ketchell, who's the editor of The Conversation. And Carolyn, you're there too, and you're another conversation person as well, right? Carolyn Southey. Is it?
The 8 slides. And so Misha's editor of The Conversation Australia. I'm the editor of The Conversation
Africa. Thank you for clarifying. So we've got a sort of great group of panelists to talk about this. Obviously I know what answer I want to get out of this, but I think my first question is there any hope? Is there any way that experts can help us rebuild trust? I'm sure some of you are going to start arguing and saying, well, what is trust? What are experts? But let's just go with the big question first. Is there any hope at all? Anybody?
Yes. We're living in a moment of dealing with what could be called a wicked... Oh, here. Let's try this. Apologies. Yeah, there is hope. We are obviously living in a moment of huge disruption. We're living amongst really what could be called a wicked problem. And as most of you will know, a wicked problem is one that is constantly changing, evolving, and it doesn't have any one solution. And that requires us to better understand the problem that we're trying to solve. So when we talk about trust, well, what do we mean by trust here today? Well, we mean by that signals around relevancy, transparency, accuracy, original reporting. We all know the values that are critical to build trust. But we also, as I say, if we're going to deal with this wicked problem, this moment of misinformation, mistrust, manipulation, we have to accept that along the way we got some things wrong as an industry, and that has to first come with a hands up and where we made mistakes and how we learn. And we have to recognise that we at times have not built the most diverse newsrooms. And if unfortunately you have a lot of newsrooms of middle-aged, often white men, well, we're going to be biased in the stories that we cover. We have to recognise that local journalism has been butchered in the last 10 years, and therefore we don't have local accountable journalism. That leads to a decrease in trust. We have to recognise the fact that we have been so reliant on the advertising model that advertising is now broken. People are so irritated about being tracked across the internet and constantly having their experience with news and information disrupted by us trying to sell products and building an experience that is constantly scrolling on websites and platforms and apps. So we've made mistakes and we have to recognise that. But I am hopeful. And I'm hopeful because I think this industry that is incredibly competitive has figured out how to collaborate. And the reason that I am hopeful is two-pronged. One, that I believe this industry is figuring out how to collaborate with researchers and scholars and fact-checkers and librarians and teachers, that we're going to solve for trust for this moment of the wicked problem. It's going to take cross-industry collaboration. That's one. And the second is that millennials, the research shows that this generation that are sensitized to Netflix and Spotify who believe in quality, who want good services, who want their content in one place, will pay for news if we serve it up properly, give them control, do it in a transparent way that is reliable, that is accurate. So those are the two things that give me hope, that there is collaboration across industry and there is appetite and need amongst the audiences.
Well, I love hope, but there is a body of academic literature that suggests that trust in journalism has absolutely nothing to do with journalism practice. In fact, it's due to previous bias. And then the other point, which Michael Schudson has made recently in Columbia Journalism Reviews, I know journalists love to think it's all about them. But if we have a world where general decline in trust in institutions has been generalized, there's inequality, which everybody is angry about, anger about globalization and all of the other things, really, is it about us or is it about something else?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I run openDemocracy, which is a global media organisation based in London, but we have people and stories everywhere. And being based in London, though, of course, the national trauma at the moment being Brexit. One of the most famous lines of the whole Brexit campaign was by Michael Gove, who was one of the leading political figureheads of the Brexit movement. And somebody on the Newsnight panel was asking him something about, experts say the economy is going to tank, etc. And he just turned around and said, I think we've all had enough of experts. And at the time, he was pilloried for this across the establishment media, and they thought these guys, the coverage of this comment was so derisive, and he was onto something. They won that Brexit campaign, and I also believe that expertise is really valuable, and I think that the expert needs a bit of a rebrand, however. And I also have lots of reasons for hope. I see many of the things that you're talking about, that people are more willing to pay for news, pay for trusted sources. That's certainly experience that we've had doing investigative journalism. The more that we reveal, the more impact we have, the more readers independently decide to support us. We don't have subscriptions, we don't have paywalls. But I think you're right, it's not about us. It's really not about us. And the thing that worries me is that in a world where we're trying to drive memberships and subscriptions and loyalty across our organisation in order to boost our revenue as advertising collapses, there's an inbuilt incentive to double down on your base and tell your readers what they want to hear. And that doesn't mean necessarily telling them things that are not true, but it affects your story decisions, it affects the type of coverage you might prioritise, and the way indeed that your reporters might frame their findings. 'Twas ever thus, right? This has always been a problem. This is not something that the onset of digital media has made worse. But I think we should be quite conscious of that as colleagues and working across different media organisations, that the model incentivises echo chambers and filter bubbles in ways which are troubling, and that trust, I think, is at the moment is more about that, about your crowd, than about your trust in experts. So I would just put that out there.
And another thought also is that it's not that people aren't trusting, it's that they're often trusting spurious experts. Right? I'll give you an example. My yoga teacher told me last fall that she was drinking kale shakes. I said, that's nice. And she said, they can cure any illness. I said, what? Where did you get that? She said, YouTube. So I did all the things you're not supposed to do. I lectured her. I said, that's totally not true. Took a page out of Miguel's book and tried to talk about scientific method, medicine, how it works. And then here comes the really horrible part of this, and then I told all my students about her, and I lectured, I mocked her all year. Here's the terrible part of the story. In January, she said to me, I have breast cancer, and I'm going to fast so I don't need to do chemotherapy. And I said to her, no, actually, that's not an option. You're going straight to chemotherapy, and I'm happy to say she is. But my point is that when people decide not to believe in vaccines or not to believe in something, they often cite some random expert that they found online. So they are thinking and they are imagining something, but they're substituting. And isn't that a lot of work? Like if everyone believes in the Earth is round and you decide to believe the Earth is flat, what kind of weird, spurious experts are persuading you of that? So what do we do about that too?
Yeah, so I think a good way to think about this is really just to place it sort of in its historical context. I mean, there was a time when mass media was run by, big, powerful institutions, and we had a public sphere that basically you could police. I mean, in my country in Australia, there's quite tough defamation laws, and you could have that because really the only way you could speak publicly in the public square was you'd get a comment in a major newspaper or, I guess radio came along after that, but there were certain places. And there were journalists who would say, okay, well, this is nonsense, this can come in, this can't come in, you can have your letter published, you can't. There were gatekeepers. And although there were lots of problems with that model, lots of people's voices weren't heard, it was dominated by old white guys. We've been through this extraordinary revolution now where everybody has got access to information. People have got voices to the public sphere, but there's no gatekeeper anymore. There's no cop on the beat. And you can really see that when you hear Google and Facebook, particularly Google, talk about this idea of teaching people digital literacy. What that means is they have got everybody's content, nonsense, conspiracy theories, things made up, jumbled it all up together and said, you work it out. So it used to be that you'd have a trust relationship, sometimes with a media institution, be it a public broadcaster or a major newspaper. There'd be a gatekeeper, and they would say, somebody came along and said, I've got this research, cleaning your teeth 10 times a day is really good for you. They'd say, actually, well, that's funded by a toothpaste company, and maybe we should be a bit careful about whether we publish it or not. Now, all that stuff's there, hidden agendas, vested interests, it's all jumbled up, and we've got to try to work it out. And the difficulty is that people in this sea of information that includes misinformation are ending up where your yoga teacher is ending up with bad quality information, because the world now is incredibly complex. And the only way to get through it, the only way to make sense of it, because we've only got so much brain space, is to outsource some of it to people who actually know what they're talking about. If I want to understand climate change, I can't do it. I need people who are climate scientists who spend their lives researching this stuff. So part of what the conversation has been about since it was founded in 2011 is actually about saying what we need more experts in the public conversation. We can't give up on experts. We've got to rehabilitate the idea of what experts do, what their value is, what they create, and how they can serve us. And part of what we've been trying to do is take expert knowledge and translate it in a way that we aim for a 15-year-old, 16-year-old readership age can understand. So if there's, MH370 goes down and there's a global search for debris, we might get an oceanographer to write a piece about how you model ocean currents. We might even create an editorial product, like a little infographic where you can put the debris in and see how you model ocean currents. But the idea is actually to use somebody that actually knows what they're talking about to give people information that they want. It's really important on things like the vaccine debates or climate science, the big hit issues. But the problem is people aren't going to trust experts on the big hit issues if they don't hear them on the other issues as well. So part of what we're trying to do is get experts sort of into that public space. And I know that there is some resistance, and Michael Gove said that thing about not trusting experts, and there's a level of scepticism. But I actually very strongly believe that we need to understand and value experts in the same way that this conference really has been all about understanding and valuing journalism as a discrete thing, because journalists, just like experts, have been the victims of the same forces, and we've been displaced in the same way. I mean, you've got people who are being on about their theories about vaccines online now, and they've got perfect access to do it. The experts have been displaced, but so have the journalists, who used to have perhaps too much control of the public conversation. But there is a place for somebody who's got some professional knowledge about sorting information in that conversation.
I wanted to challenge the earlier comment. I think you posed the question, is it about us? Actually, it's not about us. And I actually want to say that it's entirely about us as journalists.
Anya there too, right?
Yeah, no, both of you. The reason I say that is that I think, and Anya, this is something you've devoted so much of your academic career to. A lot of the problem is that we do a very bad job as journalists in explaining complex issues. And in your kind of world of economics and development economics, you've dedicated a huge amount of energy to projects that have helped develop the kind of journalism that unpacks. And I think as newsrooms have disintegrated, as the old models are dying, specialization has gone out the window. And that means we've become even worse at it. So maybe just a very brief explanation of what Misha and I do. The conversation is a very simple concept. You take the work of academics and you get them to write 800 words, and then you get a bunch of journalists and they do a massive translation job. They edit it into shape, into an article that ordinary people can understand. And to Misha's point, we're relying entirely on the person who has the knowledge, and we merely apply our journalistic capabilities, which is why I think it is about us. How do we exercise those capabilities? What do we do? What do we do? We explain, we unpack, we provide context. Listening to the debate on migration this morning, it was very interesting. All the panelists were saying that the biggest problem with the coverage was that no context was provided. The data was used really, really badly. That small numbers are made to look like very big numbers because no context is provided. So in all the editing that my team and I do, and Misha's team, all the editing is about getting that context, getting that explanation, and we're constantly asking, what do you mean by this? Can you scale this? They're all very basic journalistic principles and practices that we've all learned in newsrooms, or used to learn in newsrooms, and I think don't get practiced nearly enough. I think for me the issue is that what the conversation does is it insists you can only write if you're writing in your area of expertise. So if you're a historian, we don't actually want you to write on the subject of the galaxy. Or our worst cohorts are PhD students or professors emeritus who think they can write about everything. And we remind them that they need to stick with bones if bones is their specialization. So you must write in the area in which you're an expert. And you also have to declare your interests. The site actually demands of you that you say, are you going to make money out of this? Have you been paid for your research? And do you have anything else to declare? We have one very sweet older academic in South Africa who always declares that he's a member of the African National Congress, which I just find very heartwarming. So we make it very transparent. And I think that's the other thing that's been lost in journalism, is the transparency. So I think we've lost the skills. We're losing the skills, and it's great. I love working for a site that relies entirely on the exercise of those skills. And I think we've lost people because they don't believe the name at the top of the story. And it's, to your earlier question, is there hope? I think there's incredible hope, because I think there are projects like the one I'm involved in that are emerging to fill the gap in knowledge and good journalism. And the fact that there's such an appetite, the word you use, that there's such an appetite for the material is incredibly encouraging. People really want this knowledge. People really want to read articles that explain things to them in simple, contextualized language. Thank you.
Mary, you're finding appetite too for all those long, long stories on your website, which I enjoy.
It depends on the story. I mean, I was to your point about context, which I think was very well made. I'm going to take a number: $50 million. Now, $50 million was the subject of a story we did last week, where it was a process of a lot of investigation. We discovered that there had been $50 million that went from US Christian evangelical conservative groups to various issues and campaigns across Europe over the past decade. So over the past decade, a small number of very influential, powerful US right-wing conservative groups had put $50 million worth of money into political issues across Europe. Now, really interestingly, we went to the New York Times with this story before we released it, and they were very interested, but then they said, but it's only $50 million, like, you know. And I had to sort of patiently explain that, like, a country like Ireland, its entire budget for the last European elections campaign was $3 million. Because $50 million is just not that much money in terms of political influence over a decade in the United States. And I also had to patiently explain that the issue with this money was that we didn't know where it was coming from. We knew at the front, the organizations, but we didn't know who their donors were. And here in Europe, that kind of matters. And we have laws about this stuff. And, in the UK, if you give more than $10,000 to a political party, your name goes on a public register. We don't have super PACs, etc. So that context was something that was very important in terms of making the story land across the US media. But then there was another context which I became aware of speaking to a really brilliant woman who's setting up a community journalism network based out of New Orleans, where I told her the story and I said, there must be so many organizations that you work with that have a large number of religious, Christian, evangelical or other denomination readers, and won't they be astonished to know that many of the organizations that their churches are affiliated with are funding Italian neo-fascists? And she said, no, they wouldn't care at all. If you say it like that, they just don't care. But if you say, your faith is being used to oppress people, they will care. And it just totally reframed that perspective for me, that it wasn't about numbers, it wasn't about political groups or parties or alignment. So context matters and language matters, I suppose, is the point of that.
Yeah, going back to the starting point, I think for us as an industry, we have been obsessed with the supply of our content. We've this huge amount of content, we've this beautiful archive, and how do we stick it in as many places as possible? And instead, what we haven't thought enough about is the demand for journalism, amplifying the why. Why is journalism important? And I come from a traditional journalism background. I went to Storyful for 5 years then. It was the first social media news agency in the world. And then I went to Facebook for nearly 2 years as their global head of journalism partnerships. So I've been around the industry, different peripheral vantage points, and I came back 18 months ago to start another startup called Kinzen. And we've really tried to take a different approach to how we solve for trust and the signals that go with that around transparency and accuracy and original reporting. But the key thing for us, we're a technology company. We want to connect people, citizens, with quality news and information, with publishers who are quality, who provide relevant, meaningful content that help people better understand the world around them. So our mission is to put people back in control of news and help them create routines around it and have a sense of being empowered, inspired, for news to give them joy again. And what we've learned this last 18 months, people want control. Control keeps coming back, but publishers want control. So we're at this moment where people and publishers want to take back control. For people, it's control of their news experience. For publishers, it's control of their individual relationship with people. So what does that look like? Well, for us, we want to build personal news products. And we have 2 products so far. The first is an iOS app for people where you can come in every day and build channels based on your interests, your topics, your location, your profession, the things you're passionate about. But there are no hidden algorithms, there's no advertising, there's no tracking. You are in total control of your algorithm. It is yours. You decide what sources to include, to exclude, what topics you want to up-rank and down-rank. And we've had incredible feedback around that, because the one thing people love within it is you can decide, I have 15 minutes of a commute this morning. All I want is a 15-minute experience. I don't want this endless scroll where I feel I've spent hours endlessly, mindlessly consuming content. And the reason that we've done that traditionally is because an advertising model sustained the news industry. We're now at this point where we have to get ourselves off advertising if we're going to rebuild this sense of trust with people and say advertising is broken. We need new metrics that is less around how long can we get people to stay here, and instead giving them a sense of time well spent, that it feels finishable, that this was a personal news experience to me. Now, the key thing, I imagine many of you are sitting there thinking, well, that's all lovely if we start building personalised, localised experiences for people, but how will I be challenged? How will I find other quality? Okay, so great, good, I've got ahead of you. So how will I find those other quality news sources? How am I going to be challenged? And I don't go down into my own biases and filter bubbles. So the core part of Kinzen in all of the products that we're building is a community we're building from the ground up. So we have hundreds of curators who have come in and built channels, everything from breastfeeding to baking to cryptocurrency. So I come into Kinzen in the morning and I've got channels around platforms and startups and the weather in Dublin, my football team that causes me so much heartache, but I have to check that channel every day. But my channels in the morning are very different to my channels in the evening. In the evening, I care about my commute home, Netflix recommendations, what to be planning for the weekend. But if I only ever looked at my channel, I'm going to live in my own little world. And so every day I can come in and I see what the community are curating, and I can tap into those channels and follow them to make sure on the one hand, yeah, I've got something that's personalized to me, it's my perfect 20 minutes, my perfect 30 minutes, but on the other hand, I'm broadening my mind. Now we're taking all of the technology behind that personalize, it's kind of personalization with a purpose, and we're now taking it over to publishers and saying to publishers, we will build personalized newsletters for all of your users. They can come in and render an experience where every day they're getting the right
Please,
5
can I
articles.
ask a question?
Yes,
Thank
go
you.
for it, of course.
How is this different from Parleo, Newspicks, and all those other people who tried to create communities of curated content and then actually didn't work? Is it the newsletters? Will that be the difference?
Yeah, we're finding newsletters extraordinarily high open rates, but what we found, the commonality with the hundreds of people who've come to us, is that they recognize the system is broken and they want to be a part of fixing it. That's the number one when we go to our first members, why have you come here? And they want to be those, like they call themselves experts. I use the word curators, but all of us have some expertise, knowledge in some fields. And so it could be a florist, it could be somebody who does have the expertise in their local football club. So they're bringing something that feels like knowledge is power and that they want to share with others. And to be that signal in the noise, to be the ones in the crowd saying, come here, this is trustworthy, this is authentic, I can help guide you. And so that is what's incentivizing them, yeah.
Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Mary, you have a mixture of contributors, don't you? You've got sort of experts and or maybe lesser people like journalists. How do you find the balance? And does one build trust more than the other?
It depends on the again, it depends on the story, and I think that it's interesting because we have a mix of academics and activists and policy people and journalists writing for us. And I suppose that the principle we apply is one of pluralism, that as a platform we offer multiple perspectives on any one issue, and we actually encourage people to wear their bias on their sleeves, apart from when it comes to investigative reporting, because we think it's better, like false objectivity when you have an agenda is a problem, whereas if you show where you're coming from on a particular issue, then it's better signaled and more transparent. But I was amused by something that happened earlier this week. I know, obviously, because we have a lot of academics writing for us, lots of experts writing for us. I think what the conversation is doing is really, really good, and I like the way that you require transparency around who's the funding, the research, and so on. But I sort of slightly want to push back on the idea that a lot of academics have, that they are unbiased experts. I was listening to a panel earlier this week, and a group of progressive philanthropists in the United States who, for some reason, had invited Charles Koch of the Koch brothers to come and talk to them about his work. And he said, "Oh, we don't have an agenda. We just fund research. We just fund faculty members who are asking questions." As a journalist, objectivity is important, but normally, my worldview, my politics form the kind of questions I ask, and I'm sure that's true of my colleagues in academia. So I thought it was an incredibly disingenuous thing to say, particularly given their funding record.
Did people in the room
profile.
argue with that? The disingenuousness?
There were not enough journalists in the room. So this was a problem, because it was a room full of donors and philanthropists and people working in campaign and social change. And actually, there were no questions from the audience. And people were complaining and bristling about it afterwards, but no one got up and said, "Hang on a minute, what are you talking about?"
Can I maybe just jump in on that, because it's a really interesting question, which is got to do again with this question about who you trust and who you don't. And I think your point is a very good one, which is, obviously the Koch brothers have got a very significant vested interest. So when they're funding a particular type of research, they're trying to achieve a particular type of outcome. And if, for example, researchers that were funded by the Koch brothers wanted to write for The Conversation, they would have to declare that research, number one. And number two, we would then look at it very carefully and see if the fact of the funding had infected the argument or the way that the work was done. However, I would really push back on this idea about sort of unbiased, in that, obviously everybody has got an individual view, but I would much rather have somebody writing on climate science, for example, who has studied the topic for 20 years than somebody who is just expressing an opinion. Fundamentally, in my view, opinions are next to worthless, whereas what we need is knowledge. And when we commission an article, what we're looking for is somebody who can give the reader knowledge, convey that knowledge so that they know more than when they started reading the article. And I would really encourage a reader to read an academic, even if they've got a particular view. You can obviously see that view expressed in the work itself. Nobody's claiming perfect objectivity, of course, but at least you've got some knowledge informing what's going on. And with us, you've got some transparency about other vested interests being involved. The difficulty is there is so much content out there being pushed by so many people with so many vested interests. It really is impossible to know what to trust. So you get people believing the kale diets and the vaccine conspiracy theories and all these things. And we need to give people some way of actually saying, okay, this information is qualitatively better than that information. You do need to look at who's talking. You do need to look at whose interests they're representing. And one of the advantages that academics have is that they are generally paid by public institutions to serve the public interest. So they might have individual views that they've formed over the years of reporting on a particular topic or researching it, but at the very least, they are coming with a public interest agenda, in most cases, hopefully predominantly driving what they would do. And I would argue that in a very nuanced way, qualitatively, you should trust an academic over many other sources, and that's actually really valuable.
Well, we think so, of course.
Yeah.
Caroline, I wanted to know, South Africa seems like a great place to think about the sort of topic of the panel, which is, can the presence of experts rebuild trust? South Africa, so polarized, so much anger over corruption. Has the conversation been able to help the public conversation in South Africa? Do your experts help? Are they listened to?
Yeah, I'd say the answer is yes. And I think it's evident in the fact that there is so much engagement with the articles that we publish. I was asked an interesting question when I became editor of The Conversation Africa, which was, so what is your bias? What is your position? And it was a really shocking question, because my life had been spent in the financial media, Financial Times, and then in Financial Mail magazine in South Africa. And they did have positions. The interesting thing about The Conversation is that actually I can't have a position, because I can't tell academics what to write. So if you want to make the case for why the ANC has become like most other liberation movements in Southern Africa and corrupt and kind of lost its way and its cause, you can make that argument. You need to be able to back it up with your research. You need to be able to provide your references, but you can make that article and we will fix it for you and make it beautiful and publish it. You might also want to write an article. You might be a different academic who's very loyal to the ANC, who might want to argue that the ANC is actually different, that it is exceptional, and that it's fixable, and that all it needs is a new president and then we'll be fine. Again, we'll take your article. We won't attempt to editorialize you. But again, you must back it up. You must back it up with your research, and you must provide the references. So I think what we put into the public domain is, one, material that provides explanation and context, because that's how we've chosen to edit it, and two, that it's written by people who are very evident in what their particular position and bias is. With the collapse of traditional newsrooms, and this is happening across Africa, it's happening across the world, is we've lost 2 academics. We've had 4,000 write for us, and 2 have walked away because they can get published unedited on a website that's become quite a popular website in the country. And so what's happening is the alternative information is information that's completely uncurated, it's unedited, it's unchecked, it's simply somebody's latest thoughts that get published unexpurgated. So I think people do recognize the difference between these two things. And I think the fact that we're putting that material out every day, we're being picked up by every major news outlet. And that's true in Kenya, it's true in South Africa, and we're beginning to taste it in Nigeria. So I think the model itself speaks to people to, if you make that information available, those articles available, they will get republished and reused and used on radio and used on television, etc.
Looking at...
Well, it's just reminding me a little bit, you know, there's been so much debate about fact-checking and does fact-checking work and what is truth and what is evidence. And then I think that Tom Glacier at Omidyar commissioned a study, and it turned out that one unintended consequence about why fact-checking is a good idea is it makes politicians behave better. And I sort of feel like it's a little bit about the expert trust thing, which is people might think that experts are really annoying and having experts doesn't necessarily build trust, but without it, you're really, really lost, right? So I think we have to sort of also do that counterfactual when we think about expertise and whether it's building trust or not. That, yeah, a world of just regular people with their dumb ideas would be a really bad world.
I think also one of the things that's happened is, to be totally frank, before digital publishing, you could, in a newspaper, write a very balanced, on the one hand, on the other hand, piece, and you'd get published. And it might be quite a dull piece, but it would get published, and there was a space for that. What the current environment has done is it's incredibly overheated, it's incredibly shrill, it's an attention economy. You've got to shout really loud to get somebody to pay attention to you. And all those people that actually traditionally tried to be careful, to communicate carefully, to sort of exercise that positive contribution, have sort of been crowded out a bit. And what we're trying to do is find a way to get them back into the public sphere and into the public discussion, to put them at the centre really where they should be, and to actually model the type of behaviour that we want to see. So rather than people shouting at each other from across an imaginary divide, part of what we do is we work with academics in a collaborative way. We try to model good collaboration, mutual respect, courtesy, and even little things like we get academics to answer questions from 7 or 8 year old children. Now, the reason that we do that is because they create great articles and the kids love them, but also because what we want to do is we want to remind people, we want to remind everyone from children up, that actually there are people in the world who know things that we can learn from if we listen to them with courtesy and respect. So it's sort of about modelling behaviour as well.
I would just clarify, I mean, my remarks earlier, I'm definitely pro-fact-checking, I'm pro-editing, and I'm pro having academics who are experts in particular subjects speaking to those subjects. But I guess the thing I'd put on that, and I think it's about journalism as much as anything else, is the way that we as editors or as writers or as journalists or as reporters or as researchers and academics are sometimes not conscious enough of our own biases, not transparent enough about them, are not honest enough with ourselves about them, and therefore we aren't honest enough in the way that we present the information because we're not asking deep and searching questions of ourselves. I suppose that's where I'm coming from.
Sure, yeah.
Point is very well taken. And we have all these experts in the room, including I see Project Syndicate, and we have people are already asking if they can ask questions. So yes, please. Do we have a mic? Good. The woman, I think it's a gray shirt, was first. Yeah, thank you for raising your hand. Great. And then we have the gentleman in the blue sweater.
Thanks so much. This is such great the subject.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Juliana van
I think it's on now.
No.
Maybe.
How's this?
Yes.
Great.
Fabulous. Okay, great. So, first of all, thank you very much for a really wonderful panel. I think it's a really spot-on subject to be talking about. I'm Juliana von Rappert-Bismarck, and I run a non-profit, a journalist-led non-profit that's called Lie Detectors. And I wanted to make a comment, and then I've got 2 questions to the panel, which is, so we are journalist-led, and we actually believe, like some of you, that journalists need to be at the heart of this. And we do this, and just want to quickly say how we do it, because it feeds into a few of the things that you've said. We actually send journalists into classrooms to talk to kids aged 10 to 15 about source verification, but also about how journalism works and what we're trying to do, and rebuilding trust is very much at the center of what we do. We really want to encourage journalists to come away from their screens and actually interact with the next generation of readers. I'm sure it's important to talk to the current generation of viewers and readers, but we're focusing on the next generation.
Which country are you doing this in?
In Germany, Austria, and Belgium.
I knew you were going to say Germany. That's where it's all.
There are some good projects in the US, actually. But we're a European project. The idea is to work with local journalists across Europe. The idea is to actually demystify what we do, because we don't want journalists to look like experts. We want journalists to actually look like human beings. We want them to step away. We want them to also stop insisting on being right all the time and admit that they make mistakes and explain how, with the best intentions, mistakes can happen and bias can happen, as you were saying, and admit to their own bias. We actually insist that our journalists talk about their own bias if they have one. And so that's my comment about what we do. And then one comment about what we found is that it's not just the trust in journalism, it's actually the trust in facts that's important to instill at this time. And not just the trust in facts, but actually attaching a value to facts. Because what we're finding in the classroom sessions is that particularly adolescents are getting to a place of fake fatigue where they're like, it's all fake anyway, I don't care, I'm going to make up my own mind. And to reinstill that sense that facts are actually valuable and relevant to their lives is really, really central. So I'm really interested in hearing if anybody's doing work on that. And I wanted to put a question to Anya. So we think that what we're doing is right. And, it's one way of doing it. We get a lot of feedback from kids that say, I had no idea that journalism was so complicated, But we do need to measure it. And I've just come from a panel where Dan Gilmore was saying we need to collaborate. Where can we feed in our feedback? Like, what is the place that is actually doing meaningful work on measuring trust, where all of those of us who are sitting in this room and on this panel thinking about trust measurements and trust indicators can actually pool it together and actually come to a conclusion fast that's actually going to come to some good effect. And then a question to you, and you were talking about your citizen journalism at Kinzen. If we want to stop people just writing mad blogs about fasting instead of taking chemotherapy, do we need to then, I think it's a really interesting approach, but do we need to create curricula that are freely available for people to become educated journalists before they start writing? It's a question. Thank you.
I'll dig in on a couple of things. On collaboration, I think there's so many wonderful projects, from First Draft that is doing the cross-check initiatives, particularly around elections now. Their last one in Brazil, I think, had something like 13 newsrooms collaborating around fact-checking. They had something like 100,000 inbound queries from the public. It's a great example of collaboration. It's great to see the platforms are starting to open up around anonymised data as well, because one of my worries has been, again, in this massive moment for the industry, are we defining the problem and the solutions we're coming up with? Given everything is moving so fast, can we see what is working and what isn't? So Google, I think it's their data commons. Facebook has an initiative where they are now sharing data with scholars, with researchers, so that they can actually try and define what is the problem here, what is actually working with people. And one of the examples, which has really been great to see for the research community, is that some of the research that's been done in the last year showed to Facebook that their disputed flags weren't working. Instead, what people wanted to see were related articles. So when you see something that has been debunked, that is proven to be false, what you're seeing is a suite of articles underneath from fact checkers saying, here's a different perspective, one that has been factually put together by fact checkers. So there's lots of great collaborations. I think we almost need, though, a UN-type body that's bringing together all of this great work so that there isn't duplication, which is something I worry about, and a lot of repetition. On your point then, just broadly around curricula, back to when we say experts, I'm a huge believer we need machine learning engineers, data scientists, librarians, educators. This is something, again, back to my earlier point, that is cross-sectoral. And journalists need to be thinking about news literacy in their journalism every day. It's not enough just to the who, what, where, when, how, why in our journalism, but instead the story behind the story. How did I source this? What in this is original reporting? Why did I do this story in the first instance? And I think increasingly, if we can do that story behind the story, open up, show how the sausage is made, I think that is also going to help with transparency and trust in the work that we do day to day.
So I think you put your finger on something very important, which is that all of these wonderful initiatives, we don't actually have much evidence about whether they work. And we certainly know that Facebook has sat on a lot of the data that researchers need. So, sorry to say it, there's more literature on trust now, and we can talk about, you probably have seen some of the most recent stuff. There's a few things that get all the headlines, right? But I would say the literature on fact-checking and trust and what builds trust is sketchy. There's a lot of sort of, I won't go into all the methodological, but if anyone wants to read my 10,000-word literature review, I will so mail it to you. It took me 6 months to write, and just email me at Columbia, and I'll send it over, because I really have reviewed my study was piled with hundreds of articles for 6 months. So no, it's very methodologically dodgy, and I feel, we're doing it because we don't know what else to do, and because also, sorry to insult Facebook, but it's so much easier for Facebook, as Misha said, to blame the readers and blame the journalists than blame themselves. So, so I hope we'll make some quick progress academically in terms of what builds trust and whether fact-checking works. We're not there yet. I think we still have to do it because it may work, and the risk of not doing it is really, really high. So sorry if I sound really nasty. And ditto Brazilian fact-checking. I bet you probably want to respond now.
No, not at all. I think absolutely more data is needed. This is a wicked problem. We need to better understand it. I think there's still some basic questions when it comes to misinformation that we don't understand, which is what exposure to misinformation, what impact does that have on people and their decision-making every day in their communities, and what are the effective interventions? So I totally agree. I worry again about us replicating models that are totally unproven. So the more, again, back to my point, that we can share best practices, that we can share the data amongst our community, from machine learning engineers, data scientists, to librarians, educators, it is going to take a mass movement, mass sharing of information.
I'm the moderator. I'll say, and for Facebook and Twitter to release that to researchers as well. So last word from the snarky moderator. Okay. Yes, thank you.
You have mentioned before that there might be a correlation between a trust in institutions and trust in journalism as well. And how do you address this trust, for example, in countries that are lacking so much trust and never had stronger institutions, for example, like Brazil, that now has come to a very important crisis within WhatsApp and with its president using Twitter, as Trump does, as its main channel of communication. And this leads me to another question, which is, for example, how can academia, for example, or other academic tools, for example, can be used for this? Because I'm studying for a master's degree in which we have a discipline called analytical journalism, and we are supposed to do a causal model and a very complex thing for reporting to prove this. And my difficulty is actually that I found it very difficult to put this methodological thing in comprehension for the people when I'm doing this reporting, while my reporting could make totally sense out of it. So how can we approach these academic tools to empower people to use it some way? If I'm not clear enough.
God, that's a tough one. I don't know if I can answer that. Carol, anyone else?
Okay.
Oh.
I'm understanding you, but let me try.
Sorry?
I'm not sure absolutely I'm understanding you. When you say how can we use these tools, what tools are you talking about?
For example, how could we use methodological knowledge from academia, from experts, to empower the public, for example? How could we make this more approachable to the people, for example? Because fact-checking, for example, I think it has a more potential. This is very personal for me. It seems to be very understandable when we see the examples from Verificado, from AJ Plus in the elections of Mexico, for example. They're more approachable to the people. But for example, how can we approach the academic environment towards the people?
Okay, so at a very simplistic level, what we do at the conversation is exactly to do that. We democratize knowledge. We take that brilliant knowledge, and you probably are fairly highly specialized now as you complete your master's. You're going to become more so as you complete your PhD if you do one. And by the end of it, nobody will understand anything you say. And then you will need us. And we will ask you to tell us what you know, and we will then find words that ordinary people understand in sentences that are short, and where the most interesting point is in the intro. And then we'll write a really interesting headline, and my God, your amazing knowledge will travel across the universe. It requires those two skills, though, because you are required to become more specialized as you dig deeper into your academia. And you need help. I promise you, you need help in getting it out. But can I tell you, it works brilliantly. The astonishing thing for me has been, to talk about hope, is that all the academics, bar maybe 3 or 4, that we've worked with, love this process. They want to dance, they're just game. They get the final sign-off. They never lose control, which I think is key. But they allow us to beat up badly the stuff that they send us in the first instance. And I think it's because they trust the system, that we're never going to run away with it, but also because they find it really hard, as you're expressing, they find it really hard to explain these complex, deeply researched knowledge that they have. That sentence was badly phrased. So.
As I always tell my students, editing is love. There's all these people I want to hear from, and now I'm getting those hand signals from the back of the room. So I guess that means it's another panel's turn now. Thank you all to the wonderful panelists and to the audience. This is really great.